A rude customer refused to wait his turn, yelling, "I make more money in an hour than you do in a month." When I refused to serve him first, he smirked, "Then I'll have your job instead." I handed him an application and said, "Go ahead, let's see if you qualify." His face turned bright red as the crowd left. I work at a sandwich shop in Chicago, right in the middle of downtown. It's one of those places where the lunch rush is an absolute nightmare. People in suits, construction workers, tourists, all jam-packed into a tiny space, all hungry, all in a hurry. I've been working here for a few years now, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's how to handle the chaos. I know exactly how to keep the line moving, how to stay polite even when people are rude, and how to not let things get to me. I don't make the rules, I just take orders, ring people up, and keep everything running as smoothly as possible. But some people think they're above all that. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and we were slammed. The line was stretching out the door, customers shifting impatiently as they stared at the menu boards, waiting for their turn. I was working the register while my coworkers made sandwiches as fast as humanly possible. I barely had time to look up between orders. "Next," I called, keeping the pace going. That's when he walked in. Tall, late 40s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, expensive leather briefcase in hand. His Rolex caught the light when he lifted his wrist to check the time, and the way he walked? Yeah, this guy thought he was the most important person in the room. I had just started ringing up the next customer, an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, who had been waiting patiently, when Mr. Rolex strolled right past everyone and stepped up to the counter like he owned the place. Not a glance at the line. No hesitation. Just straight to the front. I thought maybe he hadn't noticed the 20 or so people standing behind him, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The line starts back there." He barely acknowledged me. Just gave this half-hearted scoff, like I was some minor inconvenience, and waved his hand dismissively. "I don't have time to wait in line," he said, pulling out his black Amex and tapping it against the counter. "Just ring me up." I swear, the entire shop went silent. People turned their heads, staring. Even my coworker at the sandwich station paused mid-slice. The older woman I had just started ringing up? She looked just as shocked as I felt. Now, I've dealt with rude customers before. People snapping their fingers at me, talking to me like I'm invisible, getting angry over stupid things. But this was something else. This guy wasn't just rude. He was entitled. I kept my voice calm, but I wasn't about to let this slide. "Sir, help customers in the order they arrive," I said, gesturing to the long line behind him. "You'll need to wait your turn." That's when he laughed. Actually laughed. Like I had just told the funniest joke in the world. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice just enough so only I could hear, and said, "I make more money in an hour than you do in a month." I felt my stomach drop. Not because it hurt. Not because I cared what this guy made. But because of how smug he was. Like his bank account somehow made him better than me. Like I was just some nameless worker he could push aside whenever it suited him. I could feel every single person in line watching. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. The older woman, bless her soul, raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms, looking him up and down like she was trying to decide if he was serious. I was done being polite. "Sir," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "if you make so much money, then surely you understand the concept of waiting your turn like everyone else." His smirk dropped. He scoffed again, shaking his head, still acting like he was so far above all of us. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, he said, "Fine. Then I'll just take your job instead." I blinked. For a second, I actually thought I had misheard him. Did this man just threaten to steal my job because I wouldn't let him cut the line? That was when something in me just snapped. Without breaking eye contact, I reached under the counter, grabbed a blank job application, and slid it right across to him. The smirk returned, but this time, I could see the red creeping up his neck. I could hear the line holding back laughter. I folded my arms, keeping my face neutral. "Go ahead," I said. "Let's see if you qualify." The moment that application hit the counter, the entire store held its breath. For the first time since he strutted in, Mr. Rolex looked unsure. His face went from pale to red in seconds. His smirk twitched, like he wanted to act unbothered, but he could feel all those eyes on him. The older lady he had tried to cut in front of? She let out a low chuckle, folding her arms. I could hear someone murmuring behind her, and I didn't even have to look. I knew the line was eating this up. But he wasn't about to back down. Instead, he snatched up the application, crumpling it in one hand. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head. I shrugged. "You said you wanted my job." His jaw clenched. He tossed the paper onto the counter like it was beneath him and sneered. "You really think this is funny?" "I think it's fair," I shot back. You don't want to wait in line like everybody else? The only person who skips ahead is the person behind the counter. The older woman gave a mocking gasp. Oh, does that mean I can cut the line too if I fill one out? A few people in line snickered, and I saw one of my coworkers at the sandwich station turn his back to hide his grin. Mr. Rolex's eye twitched. And then, he did something I never expected. He pulled out his phone. All right, he muttered. Let's see who really runs this place. At first, I thought he was bluffing. But then he scrolled through his contacts, hit a name, and lifted the phone to his ear. I exchanged a glance with my coworker. Who the hell was this guy calling? Then I heard it. A deep, businesslike voice answered. Yeah? And Mr. Rolex grinned. Hey, Mike. Yeah, I'm at that shop on 5th. You know the one. Your company does their insurance, right? My stomach dropped. My coworker's smile faded. I heard someone in line whisper, oh, this guy wasn't bluffing. He actually knew someone connected to the shop. I could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't funny anymore. The customers who had been laughing, now they looked uneasy. Even I felt the first trickle of doubt creep in. Had I just messed up? Mr. Rolex leaned against the counter, watching me like a hawk while he spoke into the phone. Yeah, I just had the most unprofessional experience of my life. Your people give these guys coverage? Might want to reconsider. The manager here, he glanced at my name tag, is a joke. I've been a client of yours for years, and I don't think I can support a business that treats people like this. The tension in the room thickened. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. He was actually trying to get me fired. And the worst part? It might work. I kept my face blank, but my mind was racing. Would the owner take his side? Would I get called in the back and handed my last paycheck? Mr. Rolex smirked as he listened to whatever his contact was saying. Yeah, I figured. You should probably send someone down here. I'll wait. Then he ended the call. And just stood there, arms crossed, like he had already won. The shop was dead silent. The older lady gave me a look, like she was waiting to see what I'd do. But I had nothing. For the first time in this whole situation, I wasn't sure what move to make. And that's when the front door swung open and someone important walked in. The front door swung open so hard the little bell above it clanged against the glass, and every single head turned. A tall man in a navy blue blazer stepped inside. He wasn't wearing a suit like Mr. Rolex, but he carried himself like someone who had power. His presence alone made the shop feel smaller. I knew immediately this was the guy. Maybe not the owner, but someone high enough to make a decision about whether I had a job tomorrow. Mr. Rolex relaxed instantly, flashing a smug smile like his victory had just walked through the door. Mike, glad you could make it, he said, striding forward like they were old friends. You wouldn't believe how I've been treated. Mike walked right past him. Didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, he stopped directly in front of me. You're the manager here? His voice was steady. Professional. My throat went dry. I know. I just worked the counter. He nodded slowly, then turned back to Mr. Rolex. What happened? I expected Mr. Rolex to tell his side of the story, twisting the facts, making it seem like I had personally insulted his entire bloodline. Instead, he scoffed, rolling his eyes like this was all beneath him. I tried to place an order, and this, he waved a dismissive hand at me, kid decided to give me an attitude. I've been a loyal client of yours for years, and I can't support a business that lets employees talk back to customers. It's embarrassing. I bit my tongue so hard I almost drew blood. Mike studied him for a long moment. Then, very calmly, he asked, you cut the line, didn't you? Mr. Rolex froze. The smugness cracked, just for a second. Excuse me? You cut the line, Mike repeated, his tone just a little sharper. Did you or did you not walk past everyone and demand to be served first? Mr. Rolex's mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. I could tell he was scrambling. I mean, look. It's lunch hour. I don't have time to wait behind a bunch of, Mike held up a hand. That's all I needed to hear. Then he turned back to me. What's your name? I swallowed, suddenly feeling like I was standing on a ledge. I told him. And then, he smiled. You handled this exactly the way you should have, he said. I appreciate employees who stand by policy, even under pressure. The relief was instant and overwhelming. Mr. Rolex, however, wasn't having it. You can't be serious. His voice was rising now, his whole face turning red. You're siding with them? After everything I've done for your company. Mike exhaled through his nose, clearly out of patience. You know what, Tom? Oh! His name was Tom. Somehow that made everything even funnier. You're right about one thing, Mike continued. You have been a client of ours for years. Tom nodded, smugness creeping back in. Mike smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Not anymore. Silence. Absolute silence. The entire shop stared as Mike pulled out his own phone, scrolled for a second, then hit a number. A few rings. Then, hey, yeah, it's Mike. Do me a favor, cancel Tom's contract. I think Tom actually stopped breathing. You can't, already done, Mike said, pocketing his phone. Effective immediately. Tom looked like he had just been punched in the gut. You're throwing away years of business over a sandwich shop? Mike tilted his head. No. I'm dropping a problem client who disrespects service workers. Then he turned back to me. Sorry about the trouble. You're doing a great job. Keep it up. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Mike gave me a pat on the counter, nodded at my coworker, then walked out. Tom was still standing there, red-faced and humiliated, as people in the line started clapping. But the story wasn't over. Because the moment Mike left, Tom's eyes locked onto me, and I could see it in his face. He wasn't done yet. Tom's face was bright red, his hands clenched into tight fists. For the first time since he strutted in like he owned the place, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the most important person in the room anymore. And he couldn't handle it. He turned on me so fast that I instinctively took a step back. This isn't over, he spat. You think this little stunt means you win? I didn't even have to answer. The entire restaurant already had. People were still grinning, some shaking their heads at him like they couldn't believe he was still trying. The older lady, the one he tried to cut in front of, let out a sharp, sarcastic laugh. Oh, honey. You lost the moment you opened your mouth. Someone else added, dude, just leave. This is embarrassing. A few chuckles rippled through the line. Tom's jaw locked, and for a second, I thought he might actually explode. Then, suddenly, he did something unexpected. He forced a smirk back onto his face. But this time, it was off. Stretched too thin. You know what? He said, taking a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You might have one today. But you're still just this. He gestured vaguely at me. A nobody in a stupid uniform. You'll always be replaceable. And then, he walked out. Just like that. Like he was the one deciding to leave. Like he wasn't just humiliated in front of 24 people. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, the entire shop exhaled at once. And then, someone cheered. Loud. A few people clapped. One of my coworkers actually shouted, "Get REKT." It should have felt good. And in a way, it did. But as the excitement settled, I realized I was shaking. I had never had someone talk down to me like that before. Not just the usual entitled garbage, but that last part, like my entire existence was a joke to him. My hands tightened on the counter, and I took a deep breath, trying to push it down. You okay, sweetheart? It was the older lady. She was watching me with an expression that wasn't amused anymore, it was concerned. And that was when I felt it. That awful, bitter mix of anger and hurt sitting in my chest. Because the truth was, he wasn't wrong. I was just a cashier at a sandwich shop. I barely made above minimum wage. I had to deal with people like him all the time, and I didn't even get paid enough to afford a decent apartment in the city. For a second, I felt small. Like I really was just a replaceable uniform. But then I looked around. And I saw every single person in that shop looking at me with respect. Not pity. Respect. Because I had stood my ground. Because I hadn't let some entitled rich guy walk all over me just because he had money. Because, in the end, he was the one who walked away embarrassed. The older lady patted my hand. Don't let people like that get in your head, sweetheart. That man's got a rotten soul. Money doesn't change that. I let out a slow breath. Nodded. Then I glanced at my coworker, who was still staring at the door. Think he's coming back? She snorted. Not unless he wants another job application. I left. And this time, it felt real. The rest of the shift went on like normal. People got their sandwiches. The line moved. Life didn't stop just because some guy in a suit had a meltdown in the middle of a lunch rush. But something in me had shifted. I knew this wasn't the last time I'd deal with someone like him. The world was full of Toms, entitled people who thought they were better than everyone else just because they had money. But today? Today, a nobody in a stupid uniform had put one of them in his place. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small at all. I felt powerful.